Hi, my name is Raina Bornstein. I'm 15 years old and I specialize in neuroscience, but even more specifically, I specialize in optogenetics. And what that is it's a neuroscientific technique that was recently discovered in 2009 based off of a protein that exists naturally in unicellular algae. And that protein is called channelrhodopsin. And its job within the algae is that when it detects a certain type of light from the sun, which in this case is blue light, it signaled to the rest of the plant that it was time to perform photosynthesis. And in 2009, what scientists realized is that they could actually utilize that in the human brain. And the way that they did that is they isolated channelrhodopsin and then injected it into specific neurons in the brain. And with that, they also put in the brain an invasive brain-computer interface, which would deliver light to those spots. And when light was delivered to the genetically modified neurons, then scientists realized that they were able to control the activation levels of those neurons. And the reason why that works is because of a process called action potential, which is how neurons in the brain fire. And the way that that works is in every neuron, there is a channel ion receptor. And on one side of that are potassium ions, and on the other side are sodium ions. And as long as they stay separate, the neuron doesn't fire. But then when the receptor opens up, then the two types of ions have the opportunity to mix. And when they become mixed and they become depolarized, that's when the neuron fires. And the way that that works in the context of optogenetics is that when channelrhodopsin or different types of opsin proteins are edited into neurons, they are edited onto the receptors. So when light is shown onto the genetically modified neurons, which express a type of opsin, then they are able to control the neurons, either to increase the amount of time which the receptor opens for, or to decrease the amount of times that the receptor opens. And so if the opsin is being used to manipulate the levels of the neurons to increase activity, that's called excitation of neurons. And if it's being used to decrease those levels of activity, that's called inhibition of neurons. And channelrhodopsin specifically is for the excitation of neurons, but there are many different types of opsins which are used for excitation or inhibition and that are also sensitive to different colors of light. And so optogenetics was initially discovered in 2009, and it was a pretty big deal in the neuroscientific technology community. So even if it wasn't as widespread among people who weren't a part of that group, it was pretty well known. However, a few years later, a younger sibling technology of sorts of optogenetics was discovered, and it wasn't given nearly the same amount of publicity that optogenetics had initially had. And that technique was called chemogenetics. And as opposed to optogenetics, instead of using light and genetic engineering to manipulate neurons in the brain, then chemogenetics still use genetic engineering, but in a different way and by utilizing designer receptors and special drugs, often called ligands, which references what they are biologically. The way that chemogenetics works is that instead of using the ion receptors already existing in neurons, new designer receptors are created. And to go along with those receptors, ligands are created corresponding drugs, which will specifically react to the existing receptors. And this is the way that chemogenetics works. The most popular form of chemogenetics is the DREAD method. And DREAD, with two Ds, stands for designer receptors exclusively activated by designer drugs. So when ligands, which are the drugs, are sent to neurons which have been modified with designer receptors, then it causes a chemical drug reaction. And that reaction lasts up to multiple hours, either in the direction of activation or inhibition. And one thing that makes this different from optogenetics is that when using optogenetics And activation by light will only last as long as the light is being shown on the neuron, but when one chemogenetic reaction is formed, that lasts up to multiple hours. And each of those have their different strengths because incredible temporal resolution is really helpful because it offers more control over how long the reaction will last and the intensity and duration of that. But for chemogenetics, having it consistently activated for a long period of time is uniquely helpful in situations such as trying to treat a patient with epilepsy, because when someone is having a seizure, they need to be consistently receiving nonstop treatment for the extended period of time during which the seizure occurs, and it's much more convenient to only have to do one activation as opposed to using optogenetics and having to constantly keep that light source coming in. Optogenetics and chemogenetics certainly have many similarities, as they are both used as neuroscientific techniques to control groups of neurons in the brain. They both have the capacity to be excitatory or inhibitory. They are both performed initially by injecting the brain with certain things, whether that's opsins or whether it's designer receptors and designer drugs, also known as ligands. They both take about 3 weeks after insertion to be ready to be used. And sadly, although they've both shown large amounts of potential for the future, they're each still in the mice trials phase of their development. However, there are certain things that set them apart, such as how we were mentioning before that optogenetics has very strong temporal resolution, whereas chemogenetics can only activate for long periods of time. And while the optogenetics technique of applying light to the brain for extended periods of time hasn't been found to have any harmful side effects, different aspects of chemogenetics have been found to have harmful impacts over time, such as the impact of the drug or collateral projections of performing the DREAD technique. So ultimately, the conclusion that led me to is that optogenetics, at least for the time being, is a superior method to chemogenetics, and there is some reasoning behind why it is much more well known, why it initially received more publicity, and why to this day it is far more popular in its applications. But what actually are those applications? So there are two main buckets of optogenetic and chemogenetic applications, which they both share. And those are utilizing these techniques for research and utilizing them for brain-based disorders. So one of the reasons why these two techniques are special in comparison to other types of brain stimulation techniques, such as deep brain stimulation or transcranial magnetic stimulation, is because while those other techniques can activate a group of neurons and all of the neurons in the group will be activated, which can often be overwhelming, especially in a research context, using optogenetics or chemogenetics, only the neurons which have been modified to express that genetic material will have any sort of reaction to the light or the designer drugs. So you can selectively activate only certain groups of neurons in an area without activating other nearby ones. And this is really helpful in researching the different synaptic connections of neurons, because there are billions of neurons in the brain, and each neuron has many connections to other neurons, which are called synapses or synaptic connections. And since there are so many neurons and so many synapses that each neuron has, scientists are still yet to understand every single connection between those neurons in the brain. And so the utilization of optogenetics and chemogenetics by only activating specific neurons which have been selected has enabled scientists to watch how neuron firing can travel from one neuron to a variety of neurons, and that has enabled scientists to do a new type of research on how neurons connect to each other and how specific neurons connect to one another to get a better understanding that works towards that ultimate goal of a complete map of each neuron in the brain and the way that it connects to other neurons. And then the other bucket of utilizations for these techniques is for brain-based conditions, specifically neurodegenerative conditions and psychiatric conditions. So when looking at neurodegenerative conditions, the reason why they're called that is because over time, the ability of a certain group of neurons will degenerate in its abilities, meaning get worse. So for things such as Alzheimer's, then in your hippocampus, which is used for memory, the ability of those neurons will degenerate. And so in that case, activation or excitation of neurons is really useful, because by using optogenetics or chemogenetics to force neurons in that area to stay active, then it enables scientists to use that to treat patients with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, because exciting those neurons forces them to keep their capabilities or to bring back capabilities in their levels of activity that they didn't have anymore based on the adverse effects of Alzheimer's. And then inhibition of neurons is really helpful for psychiatric conditions such as anxiety, because in those conditions, that's when certain areas of the brain, such as the medial prefrontal cortex and basolateral amygdala, have too much activation going on, and that can lead to an abundance of unhealthy stress. So by using optogenetics or chemogenetics to inhibit those neurons, then scientists are able to decrease the level of adverse effects in the over-worrying sector that a patient with one of those conditions will experience, while still keeping them with a standard amount of worrying and only lowering the amount of activity a certain degree. In conclusion, optogenetics and chemogenetics each have the potential to revolutionize the world. Although they're both still in mice trials, in the next 10 years, they have the capacity to have incredible applications. And even just this past year, optogenetics was utilized to help a blind man see, and chemogenetics was utilized to use an anti-smoking drug to modulate groups of neurons. So we've seen, even in mice trials, that the potential applications of these technologies are completely revolutionary, and that they offer us capabilities both in research and in treating brain-based conditions which haven't been seen before. Although optogenetics, for a few different reasons, because it's less harmful and has better temporal resolution, among other reasons, is slightly superior, at least for the time being. They both have incredible potential for the future of medicine and for technology and for neuroscience. Thank you.